Singularity University Exponential Medicine, 2018. Day 1 is now done. I'd like to go through a summary of what I think is some of the cool stuff from this presentation. And I'm not actually sure how long this podcast is going to take. I hope it's not going to be too long. I've gone through, I think it's about 7 or 8 hours worth of the live cast video. I couldn't be there in person, unfortunately. I'm watching it from here in Kenya. And I think there was a lot of really fun and new technologies described, and it was definitely well worth my time. We're going to go through 5 different major sections. We'll start off with the introduction and the Exponential Essentials, Part 1 and 2, which is kind of their standard overview of robotics, AI, quantum blockchain, some general exponential principles, move into some patient stories in Session 4, and then end with Session 5, which are the keynotes. This is going to be both on the audio podcast as well as the best place is actually probably just to read the blog post because that has the actual slides on it. And then you could all, of course, just watch the video otherwise, which will skim through some of the slides in the blog post. This was, again, as I mentioned, seen through the webcast, which was hosted by Shauna Butler and Jessica DeMassa. And Shauna is a nurse economist from, actually, she's pretty much worked all around the world, but right now she's the entrepreneurs in residence at Reshape at Radboud University Medical Center in the Netherlands. And then Jessica is the executive producer and also the host of WTF Health. Session 1. Will Weissman opened up the Singularity University here, and he mentioned Soul Machines, which is a New Zealand company building human life avatars with voice recognition and speech synthesis. I was also happy to see that he commented on the fact that we need to start thinking of addressing the ethical and unintended consequences of these technologies that we're building. When I was at Exponential Medicine a few years ago, it seemed that no one was really thinking about this really important part of what are the unintended consequences of what we're doing. We move into 1.2. Daniel Kraft gives his trademarked 1,000-slide overview of everything happening in exponential technologies in medicine. Some of the slides which I'd like to pull out was this humorous ones about the pyramid of human needs, which at the very bottom, above, underneath safety and psychosocial, food, water, shelter, warmth, we have the need for Wi-Fi and the need for battery life. Interesting SWOT analysis, looking at the big 4 companies investing in healthcare. An apple a day keeps the doctor away, of course, referring to Apple's move into technology. Interesting chart showing the cause of death from its peak versus the current cause of death in around 2012, showing reductions in stroke, AIDS, heart disease, and ALL, leukemia, but we unfortunately haven't made an impact yet in areas of mental health such as suicide. And of course, we know that we can use voice to help determine emotional state, which may have benefits in mental health. But I didn't realize that we also may be able to use voice as a cardiac biomarker, which is cool. Looking forward to see more information about this from the Mayo Clinic. And of course, voice can also be used not only to have patients order things, but to help coach patients. And this idea of using voice and voice synthesis as a coaching tool is very interesting. I haven't thought about this before. I really like these new updated slides to the cost per human genome from NIH, of which I've linked the original materials to the NIH website. Last I had seen these were in 2015. And we see the cost here as for genome as well as to compute a raw megabase of DNA sequence has just dropped exponentially, not to overuse the term. Move into a report here from Nature Genetics, published in August 2018. And what they were showing is how we can begin to use the genome to compute polygenetic scores for risk equivalents to monogenic mutations. So risks of heart disease or atrial fibrillation or type 2 diabetes or breast cancer inflammatory bowel disease, all coming out of genetic studies. And I think this is a really exciting area of research. And similar to this, finally, by being able to do genetic computing, we're realizing that a lot of these things that we call single diseases are actually multi-disease subsets. So Daniel showed a slide of type 2 diabetes being divided into subsets. We also know that you can do this with hypertension or many of the other conditions, which we kind of give a blanket label in medicine to as calling them a single condition. We have the digital doctor's bags slide finally updated now for 2018, showing all the technologies available on that front. Vital Connect patches doing live streaming of their vital signs. We have an interesting slide from Eric Topol showing just in the last year the number of AI algorithms which have received FDA approval, things such as CT bleed diagnosis, breast density through mammography, coronary calcium scoring, echo EF determination, diabetic retinopathy, MRI brain interpretations, wrist fractures on x-rays, CT strokes, liver and lung cancer diagnosis, atrial fibrillation on the Apple Watch, and MRI heart interpretation. We have a picture of sources of data for our digital health cloud, updated, of course, to 2018. We have the clinical data, device data, imaging data, omic data, and immunoprofiling data. This is, of course, tying back into Eric Topol's idea of different data layers, which he had discussed in one of his previous books. And I was very happy to see a slide showing the work being done in digital health in China. Now, this is an area which admittedly I'm far too ignorant of, and I think many of us here in the West are far too ignorant of the huge amount of scale that these companies in China have as far as innovation and number of users. So there's Ping a Good Doctor, which is over 190 million users. There's Ali Health from Alibaba, as well as WeDoctor, which is from, of course, the giant Tencent with over 100 million users on their health platform. This is an area I'm going to be investigating quite a lot more research in the coming weeks and months. But unfortunately, when I tried doing that in the past, it was actually a bit hard to find articles written in English. Daniel was also discussing the fact of custom printing medications, which is something obviously which has been talked for a lot in the past, but I didn't realize actually how far this technology has come, being able to print someone a custom statin beta blocker ACE inhibitor, so they only have to take one pill. And he actually just released a TED Talk this month in October on personalized pills and medicines for the pharmacy of the future. That video is linked in the blog post. There was a very cool image graphic of crowdsourced data, specifically on Rome, using waves data to source waves and maps. And it raises the question on how when we crowdsource medical data to impact clinical decision making. I know, of course, in the past we've often talked about epidemic and infectious disease tracking, but there must be a number of other ways which we aren't thinking about how crowdsourced data is going to influence healthcare. And I really like this line that Daniel used of we can all not only be organ donors, but data donors as well. We move into now section 2 on exponential essentials. This was by Neil Jacobson, who's, of course, the chair of AI and robotics at Singularity University. He starts off showing some interesting work from the Google and Stanford teams on retinal imaging, and how even though human clinicians have been looking at the retina for decades, it's only with this new work here out of AI-assisted retinal imaging that we realize new things, such as retinal patterns vary by age, gender, and smoking status. Some slides were shown from DARPA suggesting there's maybe 3 waves to AI, the first being handcrafted knowledge or rule-based AI, which got okay outcomes but were incredibly manually intensive and very difficult to adapt to new data. Then we're in the second wave of AI, which is what we're in right now, which is statistical learning using neural nets, which is decent at classification and prediction, but really poor at reasoning and abstraction. And of course, then this third future way, which we aren't at yet, will be how to take information which is perceived and learned and move it into the area of reason and abstraction. And of course, right now, machines are not good at explanation. And, this is a problem because in medicine, we obviously want to know why a machine is proposing a particular treatment. You could reduce this to the simple question of, why does the machine think that this is a cat? It would be nice that it told us, well, that this image has fur, whiskers, claws, and these features. But right now, the software and machine learning isn't there. And of course, we have certain biases in data sets which cause errors when training data. There was a direct comment almost made at the new book this year in 2018 on prediction machines. And Jacobson commented that some people will say that AI is just about prediction, but he views really prediction just a middle step in where the end goal is, which is really prescriptive analytics. So we don't want to just be able to predict what will happen, but we want to be able to prescribe how can we make it happen, meaning, what will be the next steps that should occur based off of particular predictions insights. One slide, which was a bit amusing, was a lot of AI terms applied to British business jargon and the competitive advantages that businesses will see. There were some updated CBI insight maps, which are always good to look at on an annual basis. One looked at the AI 100, which was a ranking of 100 most promising private AI companies. You can find that linked on the blog post. Those top companies were Freenome, Babylon, Recursion, Tempus, AICure, Flatron, and Artis. There's also another chart updated again, 2017 now, the 106 startups transforming healthcare. And I think the important thing to realize is that there really are AI healthcare startups looking at pretty much every field within healthcare currently. So a lot of us have the perception that it's just medical imaging and diagnostics, but the reality is that people are working in all areas of medicine. Interesting slide on convergence of neural nets. They showed how a hexagonal firing pattern, of which I don't really know what that means, but this particular pattern on how the computer had designed an AI neural net to solve a maze problem actually mirrored the hexagonal firing pattern found inside of a rat's hippocampus and cortex, suggesting that we're finding convergence on the way that nature naturally comes up with neural net patterns, as well as the way that synthetic AI systems derive these. My understanding is that there's several other ones out there, such as, I think, facial recognition, if I recall, has convergence in the way that the digital systems and the natural systems approach this. AlphaGo Zero, of course, came up for discussion. And in particular, they talked about AlphaGo Zero, which was the version of AlphaGo which was built on reinforcement learning, which is meaning instead of watching humans play games, which was the previous method of training, they simply told AlphaGo what the constraints, what the rules of Go are, and then had the AlphaGo Zero algorithm play against itself within these constraints. And using this technique within 3 days, the software was able to beat the previous champion from the level of 2015. And then within 21 days of training, AlphaGo Zero was able to beat Kiji, who was defeated by AlphaGo in 2017. And then they applied this system of reinforcement learning to chess. And within 24 hours, it created a superhuman computer, essentially, as far as being able to win at chess. And so very rapid levels of advancement. NVIDIA has a low-voltage AI chip called Volta. Google Cloud, I didn't realize, had actually purchased Kaggle, which is the data science competitions website. And there's another website which is cool called Experfy, which is a place you can post your big data problems, and then experts will bid on demand to solve problems for you. And it's kind of a way to crowdsource a solicitation of bids on AI work. He showed a funny montage of robots falling over, and people like to watch robots fail, but it was kind of scary to watch how fast these robots in the DARPA competitions have moved from 2015, where they would fall over frequently, through 2016, 17, and 18 in particular, with that work in Boston Dynamics. And now they're really at a Terminator-grade capability in terms of balance and locomotion, which is terrifying. It's important to realize that the speed of change can happen rapidly. Transportation was used as the example. In 1904, almost every thing in the picture of New York City was full of horses, but by 1912 there were more cars than horses, and by 1917 New York was pretty much all cars. And so a very short timeline to see transformation. He talked about a new FDA-approved robotics company, Monarch Robot, through Auris Health, which is using a very flexible surgical robot which can get into the peripheral lung nodules for treatment and diagnosis. And he ended with some work from Cornell on Cohen and McLuhan, who are using micron level, 25 micron wide graphene panels to create nanorobots, which is really cool. We're continuing to move along now into the next presentation on AI in Medicine by Anthony Chang. He talked about a few myths. The first was that AI was going to replace doctors. He suggested that AI was just another step in the progress of automation within healthcare. One of the interesting terms he used was that we're going to move from evidence-based medicine to intelligence-based medicine. And this concept of intelligence-based medicine is combinations of machine intelligence plus clinical intelligence. An example of where this was happening practically was a datathon, where they brought data scientists and clinicians together to try to solve problems. There was an interesting chart. You can see the full chart on the blog from IEEE Spectrum, and they showed on the left side wins for AI, and on the right wins for doctors in the area of healthcare, tracking back from the present in 2018 through to 2006. And if you view this graphic online, you can click on any of these particular categories and view the full story. Essentially, they're trying to show a story of increased amounts of work that AI is being more successful than physicians at doing. There was an interesting graphic that Anthony showed looking at how something, for instance, that radiologists do involves a certain amount of perception, such as medical image interpretation or integrative data analytics. And there's other things that they do, such as cognition, which includes decision-making and problem-solving. And as we see machines being better at the perception tasks, which was the work spent there in red, radiologists should shift their work, as you can see in the blue outline, to doing more cognition tasks. And, this is the way that radiologists won't be put out of businesses. They're going to just shift the work that they primarily focus on. There was a suggestion, that AI is about big data, but one of the issues is that most of our data, 89% was the number he quoted, in healthcare is actually unstructured. And there's this really beautiful graphic, which I found the original copy in JAMA 2014 in the article Finding the Missing Link for Big Biomedical Data. And this graphic shows types of data in healthcare, structured data and unstructured data, and all the different places that this information is currently being recorded as far as registries and coding systems. It's a really cool article. It's only 2 pages. I recommend that you pull it up in JAMA if you have access to it. He used the term that AI is a single light bulb in a primitive hut, meaning that AI is just one small piece of the larger digital healthcare problem. And our bigger problem is data and the portability of data. And, we have really big problems in healthcare where we can't even solve, the hour time change problem. This was the weekend where the hour switched, whereas other industries have already fixed this problem. And the hope is that AI will not dehumanize medicine, but make it more human. We know that patient satisfaction doubles when you remove a computer from the room. And so in theory, if we could have natural language processing, we could automatically do note generation and at the same time reduce physician burnout. And of course, the other big benefit to medical AI is that the rate of knowledge is doubling. He quoted statistics suggesting in 1950, the rate of medicine knowledge doubled every 50 years, and then in 2020, that medical knowledge will double every 73 days. And so AI is really the best way to keep up with this. Next, we move into a presentation on quantum computing by Deepak Akura, who's a fellow Canadian out of Vancouver. Company there, 1QBit. I really liked the first graphic he showed, which was Moore's Law, showing that the number of transistor components on a chip will double every 2 years. And he showed this visually, and we can see those number of components doubling with time. Now, of course, the problem with Moore's Law is that although the number of transistors continues to increase and double every 2 years as expected in microprocessors, we are seeing plateauing in the performance statistics such as speed, power, and the question is, what the next step will be. We are been using traditional approaches, which means that we keep shrinking the components. Currently they're about 22 nanometers, and if we shrink them down a little bit more, we'll get to 7 nanometers, but the cost to do this rises dramatically. Now, just for reference, a strand of human DNA is 2.5 nanometers. And so we're operating at a very, very small scale. And part of the other reason is that we need a massive jump in our computing power because we still can't solve a lot of the really simple questions in the world. There was a quote here from Krishna, head of research at IBM, and he said, quote, "If I try to map a caffeine molecule problem on a normal computer, that computer would have to be 1/10 the volume of this planet in size." And so there's a lot of molecular problems which we really can't begin to explore whatsoever until we have significant advances in computing. And the hope is that quantum computing will get us there. He proposes 3 stages of computing. We're in the classical stage, and then we're going to move into a quantum-inspired and into a noisy intermediate quantum stage before we finally get to a full quantum stage. And of course, quantum is this weird area. You can read about it on Wikipedia, things like quantum superposition and quantum entanglement, which are really, really wacky ideas about how the world works and how qubits function. And the work in quantum computing has progressed very rapidly, even in the last 1.5 years. There's a nice infographic showing the difference between 2012 to 2017 and just the work in these last 18 months making progress. And of course, he also discussed reinforcement learning, bringing up the area of AlphaGo, which we discussed previously. And reinforcement learning is a new technique where you tell the computer what the constraints are, and it begins to experiment and try to meet those constraints on its own. And the example he also gave was on Google DeepMind, using a reinforcement learning AI to train the AI to walk. And, at first it looked goofy, but then it's a cool video. I recommend you watch it. It's also linked in the post. He did mention at the end a quick comment in security and encryption, which is a concern of mine, that most encryption protocols, to my understanding, will essentially be breakable and useless once we enter into quantum computing. And so the question is, how can we develop new quantum encryption techniques to secure data? All right, we're moving along here. 2.4, Blockchain 101. Nathana Sharma gave a great presentation on some of the practical uses of blockchain. And she started discussing that a big problem in healthcare comes from the fact that we have incomplete information or fake information. And specifically, she discussed the fact that fake medicine kills about 1 million patients a year, and that 1 in 10 drugs in the developing world are fake. And a very cool company was brought up called MetaLedger Project. Now, this is a consortium of pharmaceutical companies which is working on an open and decentralized network for pharmaceutical supply chain management, meaning that you can do drug verification or change of ownership or contracting or chargebacks using a blockchain. Now, the reason I find that this is a particularly interesting project is that, just a few years ago at Medicine X, people were talking about blockchain and that pharmaceutical supply chain and provenance validation is a potential use for this technology. And it's cool to see that people are actually beginning to work on that. We have to remember blockchain is a very new technology. It only was really discovered around 2009, with first discoveries of really advanced computation being done on the blockchain in 2015. Some concepts she brought up was the fact that it's a peer-to-peer distributed network, which means that data deletion problems should be minimized because it's decentralized. And, I also like the fact that this removes power of major companies or single institutions. You have cryptographically connected entities, which means you can create trust and cooperation between different groups, which is good for complex systems and good for healthcare data because we know that we're going to be needing to port this data between different groups. That network data updating problem has been really solved in some ways with blockchain, and there's different techniques to do this, but it essentially allows you to track information as changed when and by who. There's always been problems with data convergence and with distributed systems, and blockchain is hopefully working on ways around this. And then, of course, there's different types of blockchains. One such as a permission blockchain allows certain users to see the data. And there's a cool project being done in the UK, which I actually want to learn more about, called Medical Chain, which you can see the linked Medium post, but it's essentially a permission blockchain for electronic health records. The book she suggested is one called Truth Machine, or The Truth Machine, The Blockchain and the Future of Everything. It was published in 2008. There's a previous book by the authors, Casey and Vigna, from 2016, but as the authors themselves have said, that book is now already rapidly out of date. So the question is, how can we use blockchain in an intelligent way? It's a new technology. It's been way overhyped in the media, but there are some very specific uses which I think are going to be very good, in particular for pharmaceutical supply chain. And I'm glad to see that work is being done on that. So that was the first part of the session. They then went into a break of a webcast with Jessica and Shafi Ahmed. And he's the professor of surgery and associate dean at Bart's Medical School. Now, he talked about a few things which are exciting in the area of healthcare. And the reason that healthcare is exciting is because many of the technologies which we see can all converge into medicine. So, for instance, we have robotics advancements, meaning we're having new inventions in robotics. Intuitive surgical has really dominated that surgical market for the last 15 years with the Da Vinci robot, but we're seeing new companies such as Cambridge Medical Robots or CMR Surgical. There's Verb Surgical, which is a group from Google and Johnson & Johnson, and about 5 other companies in the space. And one of the interesting side effects he mentioned is that as we're adding more robots to assist in surgery, what it means is that we're going to actually develop better quality outcome data in surgery, as well as specific data on the skill of the operator, which is much needed. Other cool tools, of course, AR. We just had last week the first FDA-approved AR platform for surgery. VR is going to affect training and education, as well as we're seeing that being used in small ways. And he commented on the fact that our medical education is a little bit silly. Why is it 5 years? Why is it not 4 years? Or why is it not 6 years? The number seems in some ways arbitrary. We need to think more critically about the way we train doctors and what we train doctors in. And I entirely agree with him on this, in that many of the skills that doctors will need in the next 10 to 30 years are not being taught in medical school. And in some ways, we aren't even selecting for applicants with these types of aptitudes. He said, if you accept what we do today as the best, you are in fact mediocre. We then move into session 3. Back into Exponential Essentials, there was a presentation by Raymond McCauley, who's, of course, the Singularity Chair on Digital Biology. A lot of interesting work. Consumer genetic tests. There's currently 250 companies in the US and 400 companies worldwide doing this type of direct-to-consumer genetic testing. You can buy them off the shelf at Walgreens or online at CVS on Amazon. Origin 3N, of course, was discussed. They're the company which can do propensity for obesity or addiction, and they were offering their tests free to participants at the conference. There's other companies such as BasePaws, which do genetic testing for animals. Within this area of genetic testing, we have things such as pharmacogenetics, which is your body's response and interaction to drugs, which is newsworthy because the FDA has now removed all previous limitations which were on 23andMe in regards to this area, and so they'll be able to release this information to customers again. There's Epigenetics, which is trying to look at how genes are expressed, and there's different companies looking at this. So Chronometry, which charges up to about $1,000 for their work, and you can get it all the way down to companies such as Life Epigenetics from USource, which is free, but it's free because USource will then underwrite your life insurance and use this epigenetic data to affect your risk models. There was discussions about acquisitions. Illumina acquired the rival PacBio for $1.2 billion. And a really interesting story with BGI, or the Beijing Genomics Institute. Now, this group, the BGI, was previously Illumina's biggest customer of sequencers. And then BGI ended up manufacturing their own sequencer, and it can do 7 terabytes of data in a single day, so easily a single human genome. And Illumina tried to block BGI's sequencer, saying that, going to the US government and saying that this will give China too much dominance in this space. BGI is a really big company we need to watch. Some of the other work that they're doing, for instance, is they've made these things called micropigs, which were initially being used for research, and then people thought that they were really, really cute, and so they started to sell them as pets in China. And we need to put this in context versus how things are done in the US, where genetic engineering for pets has been banned. Very different approaches in this space. Another interesting concept, which is De-Extinction, or the revival of ancient species. There is the moa bird, which is this giant, ancient 700-year-old bird, which had its DNA recovered. And there's a book, if you're interested in this, called Woolly, which is the true story of the quest to revive one of humans' most iconic extinct creatures. And we aren't at the place where you can buy extinct creatures or Jurassic Park yet, but from the data extraction perspective, that is now doable. Cellular agriculture, which isn't really genetic engineering, but it's growing meat cells outside of an animal, is moving forward. Many companies in this space, many companies actually selling in restaurants around the world. You've probably heard of the Impossible Burger or Beyond Meat as just 2 examples. And then, of course, other breakthroughs in things such as CAR T therapies, where we take cells from a patient, re-engineer them, and then put them back into the patient's own body. There's only 2 therapies currently approved for CAR T, of which one of them is, it's hard to pronounce, but it's Kymera by Novartis. It was approved right after phase 2 trials, which is really impressive, and it treats ALL. Half the patients went into remission after 12 months. Now, of course, it does cost $500,000, but the pricing scheme is really interesting because it uses something called results-based pricing, meaning that if the drug doesn't work for you, you get a refund. I actually like this results-based pricing and think that a lot of other medical interventions probably should adopt it if we're thinking probably for the best interest of customers. A few other companies were mentioned at the end of the presentation, one called RetiSpec, which is a company which is using cameras and AI to examine the retina to detect a biomarker of cognitive decline. The hope is to be able to identify this prior to cognitive decline, meaning that we could, of course, intervene. A company called Hum, which applies a small electrical current to the brain to improve working memory, concentration, and visual attention. And there was an end with a product by Amenable Labs. I actually got to see this in person when I was there. And this is kind of the easy bake oven for children. You can buy it off the shelf now, and it's a DNA playground. You can change bacteria's color and smell and alter their DNA with this science kit for the 21st century. All right, we'll move on to 3.2, Regenerative Medicine by Neena Tandon. She's the co-founder of Epibone, which is a cool company where they take a CT scan result and essentially map out the bone which needs to be replicated. Then they take adipose tissues from the patient, they extract stem cells from those, attach the cells to a scaffold inside of a bioreactor, which encourages cell differentiation and growth into bone cells. And then 3 weeks later, you have a new piece of bone or cartilage ready for implantation. And they're going to be going to human trials just in the next year. And of course, this has lots of benefits. The new bone or cartilage fits perfectly and apparently integrates well into the body because the tissue is alive. She also had some other discussions on tissue engineering. Dr. Anthony Atala back at Wake Forest grew patients' own grew bladders from patients' own cells back in 1999. We have newer companies doing vascular medicine regeneration, such as Humacyte, which is in phase 3 clinical trials. A company called United Therapeutics, which is very large. They're working on printing more complex tissues, such as lungs. There's work being done by Sanjit Bhatta at MIT, trying to diagnose colon cancer by having patients take a probiotic or bacteria, which when ingested will create a luminescent bacteria, which can be detected by a urine test. And of course, Daniel Kraft at the end brought up the question of, when we get to complex 3D printed, are we going to be doing more complex 3D organ printing, or are we going to try doing xenotransplantation as a method to print more complex organs? And it's a little bit too hard to say. The advantage of xenotransplantation is there's already some trials in that area underway. And so I think the big takeaway I had was I didn't realize actually that we're in clinical trials using tissue engineering. I thought it was more in animal models at this time. There's an interesting idea, though, of starting to ask what we can do with cells outside of simply biology. And there's this idea of biofabrication that you discussed. For instance, one company is using biofabrication to create silk out of yeast. Or there's a company called Ecovative, which is creating essentially mushrooms to engineer packing materials. Or a company called Planty, which allegedly is able to harness the electrons in plants for energy. Or Biomason, which has a concrete with the bioactive substance in it that when exposed to water, meaning that there's cracks in the concrete, that then it uses the bioactive substance to heal. Of course, the presentation ended with the very reasonable questions of what shouldn't we do and what are the boundaries of the human body. And, we went through this first industrial revolution of machines and a second industrial revolution of data. And if the third industrial revolution is going to be of life and biology, and what are the appropriate limits and constraints that we should put onto this technology. We continue on. Session 3.3, Deep Learning in Medicine. This one was by Jeremy Howard, and he's the founder of Fast.ai. Really interesting how he got interested in AI and healthcare. I really actually want to meet him and talk to him about this, because he has the same interest in this area that I do. And he had seen several years ago a World Economic Forum graph showing that if we try to imitate traditional development paths, it's impossible to use this for new emerging economies. For instance, in Nigeria, if we were to try to raise the number of doctors they currently have per 1,000, per patient, like per 100,000 patients, to the number of doctors required, we would need a 12-time increase. And in order to train this number of doctors, we would need $51 billion, which is 20% of their GDP, or 10 times the current public health expenditures. And we'd also need 300 years to do it, meaning that the current approach we have just will not work. Now, we can then think, how could we overcome the limitation of the number of doctors there are using machine learning to try an AI to help answer these gaps of Clefaire's diagnosis and disease management. Now, when he got interested in this, he went to the radiology conference, RSNA, and nobody was talking about machine learning. And I had the exact same very peculiar experience several years ago, realizing that no one was interested in this space. Whereas now, of course, things are very different, or at least in the radiology field, where if you went to RSNA this year or last year, it was really all a buzz about deep learning. Although admittedly, that's not really in other fields yet in healthcare. There was a discussion about myth of loss of skills, which is an argument we've had previously, suggesting if AI does medicine, people will forget how to be doctors. But we've seen this, with traction control and ABS brakes. People said that we'll forget how to drive. That if we introduce spelling and grammar check, people will forget how to write. That calculators and spreadsheets will allow people to forget how to do math, or that speech recognition will allow people to forget to type. He also introduced the example of if we introduce fly-by-wire, essentially automated airplane flying, that pilots will forget to fly. But it's important to realize in that example, actually, that the airline industry has taken very deliberate steps to ensure that pilots do not forget to fly. He said, of course, deep learning is not a fad, because if it is, it's a fad 60 years in the making. Few interesting examples of what deep learning algorithms are capable of now. One is by interpreting how to fill in photos. And so we see several photos stitched together on the screen with data on the outside of the images missing in the gaps between these photos. And the AI was able to logically figure out what should be placed into those gaps. We also see that AI is being effective at speech, with China's Baidu being able to be more efficient at English and Mandarin speech recognition than most human people. And of course, deep learning isn't just for medical imaging, but also for speech and for language. And we see an example from NYU using deep learning to look at EHRs and be able to predict chronic diseases using the unstructured medical notes, and how these deep learning algorithms are able to diagnose using better than the previous logistic regression models. He talked about his own company, Fast.ai, which has been trying to make machine learning easier. And in his example, he shows how Fast.ai requires, for instance, only 5 lines of code to use their tool versus the previous gold standard, such as PyTorch or Keras, which needed 31 lines of code. And also the newer Fast.ai tools run quicker and have less errors. And so his goal is to be able to, every year, double the performance, meaning accuracy and time, and to reduce the amount of code required to run the algorithm in half. So in about 2 to 3 years, he hopes that you actually will not require any code at all. and this will allow more people to be able to start to use AI algorithms. And he ended the presentation by showing a bunch of examples from students in his online class that created really amazing things. And these were people who had only 1 year of coding experience and had only taken about 1 week's worth of his lecture. He ended with a new company called Whamry, Wicked AI in Medicine Research Initiative. And this is a group where if you have data, you can submit it to these UCSF data researchers, and they'll work with your institution to solve your medical data challenges, and then together you can publish an academic paper on it. Move into next section, 3.4, by Carmen Morcos, called Exponentially Human. And she discussed, what is your highest value in life? How can we impact the social determinants of health, which we know have such a large impact on people's health, by being able to now finally measure things such as social support, social exclusion, transport, food, work, stress, social gradients, addictions. Interesting opportunities here. We move into the next session, which is session 4, where we have several different patient experiences. The first is by Anita Ravi, who's a physician who works at a Purple Clinic, which is a clinic in New York City for marginalized patients, really looking at, when we talk about quality metrics in healthcare, we often don't understand the barriers that some patients may have to being able to, for instance, meet these quality metrics. And similarly, certain patients may understand what quality healthcare is a very different way from these aggregate metrics that we consider are required for good care. For instance, patients probably don't have enough money in her clinic to be able to come to clinic, and in fact may not even have enough money often to feed even their own children. So their values are very different. And Neena asked one of her patients who seemed like a really successful patient in that they were able to come to clinic, how they were able to get there on time. And the way that this story unfolded was that mother and child actually would leave 3 hours early for the appointment so that they could get to the subway to beg for a subway ticket. And if they couldn't get a ticket, they would then jump the turnstile, which means that, of course, they could then be at risk of arrest and imprisonment. Of course, after hearing that story, Neena and the clinic now hand out Metro cards, but it really shows how little sometimes we really understand about our patients and their backstories outside of the clinic and the direct medical experience. One of the interesting problems she brought up with scribes is that it adds more people to the room. And this means that you may have patients who are already reluctant to share personal stories or sensitive details about their health history or history of violence. And scribes may even compound this issue. And we have other patients who have such high levels of anxiety that going just even the doctor results in very delayed presentations. Of course, wondering how we can reach out to these types of patients. One of the big takeaways at the end was the fact that many of her patients don't have a home. And so this means that they don't have a zip code. And if you don't have a zip code, you aren't often in a lot of aggregate data sets. And she wondered, when we look at healthcare data, we should always ask ourselves what data could be missing, meaning that what type of patients are marginalized or are not being captured by these data stories which we're allegedly being told, whose voices are not being heard. And it's just an important thing to consider. She also mentions, of course, worrying a lot about the patients who don't show up to her clinic, which in many ways are patients whose data we don't have. I've done some blog posts on missed patient appointments in the past, and it's a very complex problem. It's not as simple as that they just forgot. We move into the next section, presentation by ePatient Dave. Now, ePatient Dave has a new book, Super Patients, He's given over 600 talks in 19 countries, and he's a self-identified healthcare activist. And back in 2009, he tried to get his data out of his hospital EHR and found that what he got was really useless. And this ended up spurring a talk he gave in 2009 at Medicine 2.0 conference called Give Me My Damn Data. Ever since this, it's really become, in many ways, a global sensation with Lucien, who founded the hashtag Patients Included from the Netherlands, after the fact that many conferences were not including patients, and he therefore refused to actually speak at any conference that wasn't including patients. Dave talks about interesting metric called Amenable Mortality. Now, this is graphs and metrics from the Global Burden of Disease Survey, which I've talked about a lot in the past, but Chris Murray's work there in Washington. But essentially, it looks at deaths in a country that had financial and technical abilities to prevent those deaths. So it's an interesting metric to look at. Dave's real big thesis, though, is that we need to let patients help and care, that patients want to help and care, and that we do have some problems with the current state of healthcare in that some of the incentives really don't line up properly. We know that the patients have the most at stake. It's really their lives. They're the ultimate stakeholder. And we see articles such as this one here on Goldman Sachs asking, is curing patients a sustainable business model? While this proposition carries tremendous value for patients and society, it could represent a challenge for genome medicine developers looking for sustained cash flow. As Dave kind of is pointing out, the current healthcare system isn't really responding to the needs of patients well enough. And he imagines a time of tremendous disruption in healthcare as data, which previously was locked into institutions, is now becoming more freely available. And the reason that this is important is because people are not waiting. Another hashtag which he discussed is the one we are not waiting hashtag. And patients are starting to work on healthcare innovations using these new tools themselves. Yeah, of course, the famous Night Scout project was discussed, which is that to create an artificial pancreas to help monitor diabetes. And this has really become a open source global project with many individuals committed to trying to improve the solution, because the typical pharmaceutical and medical device industry was not looking to meet the needs of these type 1 diabetic patients well enough. Some other interesting examples of what happens when you liberate data in an industry. Katie McCurdy, who is a graphic designer, produced these really beautiful and informative infographics on her health story to help explain it to other doctors, and has since started a company called Pictal Health, which uses visual communication for doctors and patients. We also saw an example by Kate Sheridan, who was a patient who had a horrible case of Lyme disease and ended up, as part of her treatment, her mom typed in over 1.5 feet worth of medical papers, this huge stack of data into Excel to try to track it, trend it, quantify it. And of course, this process would have been much more easy if they actually had what Dave calls data spigots, or essentially the ability to take data and to share it from the clinician to the patient digitally. And eventually, fortunately, Kate recovered and is doing well. But as Kate has said herself, we only spend about 1% of healthcare venture capital on helping patients manage their own health. And we have our priorities in this case misaligned. One last great patient story was about Michael Morris, who was unfortunately diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at a young age, colorectal. And as his background was in software development, he built a great tool to pull data from his 4 hospitals using the FHIR protocol and then track his care in real time and between treatments. If you're interested, there's a video on YouTube from his presentation at the September HL7 Fire Conference. I want to actually learn a lot more about this, because these screenshots that we're seeing here on the dashboard he's created for oncology are really some of the best visual displays of medical data that I have ever seen, and I want to go through them in quite a lot more detail and actually try to meet Michael, because I am really impressed with the work he has done here in communicating clinical data efficiently and effectively. Finally, Dave ends with a really interesting, horrible story about how the healthcare data problem is a chicken and the egg problem. He discusses how the CMIO at his hospital, Beth Israel, had blogged about the fact that no patients had requested ever to download their health data of their 2 million patients. But then Dave found out that the reason that no one had requested that is there's actually not a button on the website to do that. And so he went and he emailed his hospital asking how he can download his data. And they said, well, actually, you can't. The button's not there, but talk to medical records. They can help you. But as you can imagine, he talked to medical records, and they said that it's impossible to get the digital data. And so we have this problem of the fact that patients are unable to get the digital data, and therefore there's the perception that patients don't want it. And when patients do get the digital data, it's viewed as poor quality, or there's nothing you can do with it. And partly the reason there's nothing you can do with it is because the data being provided isn't very good quality. As Dave says, don't become a proud expert on an obsolete model. And he quotes then Max Planck, who won the Nobel Prize in 1918. A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather its opponents eventually die. So, as Dave says, enable radically disruptive data spigots, set yourself on fire. All right, we move to one of the last stories. This was kind of a fun story from Shafi Ahmed, again, which we discussed previously. He's the surgery professor. And this was on how connections at conferences can lead to really unanticipated results. And so last year, a group from Bolivia met Shafi, and they were very excited to meet him. Shafi also met with Hector Valle from Mexico, and out of this spawned a new conference in digital health in Mexico. Shafi would then meet Martin Dockweller, who invited him to South America. Martin's invested in many universities in Bolivia and sent him this itinerary saying, when you come to Bolivia, you will meet the president, you will receive an honorary PhD, and then you'll receive the keys to the city. And it turns out when he did arrive that this actually happened. In fact, when he had landed, they told him that people were waiting for him, and national news had been paused to live stream his arrival in Bolivia. And then he got the keys to the city and met the president of the country. And then Martin sat down with him to tell him about this new large hospital which they need in Bolivia, and that he wants it to be the digital hospital of the future, which is, of course, why he wants Shafi to be involved, and that they were going to call the Shafi Ahmed Martin Dockwilder University Hospital, SAMD. And so it's kind of a hilarious story, very inspiring. And of course, it also shows, Martin Dockwiller really knows how to flatter a prospective client. We move into the last story, which was Naveen Jain was interviewed. He discussed moonshots and some exponential entrepreneurship. He has a company called Viome, which is doing some genetics and epigenetic sequencing. But as he pointed out, it's a lot easier in some ways to solve really hard problems than easy problems, because when you're trying to solve a hard problem, everyone else in the world wants to help you, and especially the really best come to help you and work with you. And so focus on the hard problems. And when you're focusing on a hard problem, sometimes the experts in that area aren't the right people to talk with. Because they're an expert, they may have a particular line of thinking that won't allow you to get to the next level, which is needed for the breakthrough. You had some kind of wonky, but out-of-the-box ideas there, such as looking at particular bacteria which we know are resistant to radiation, and then trying to use CRISPR to insert that trait into humans, so that in theory we can go and live on the moon. And as he said, I know nothing about medicine, and therefore this makes me the most dangerous person in the system, because I challenge every fundamental assumption. We move into the end. Keynotes about the future. The first was by John Halamaka. Great guy. He's the Chief Information Officer and the Dean of Technology at Harvard Medical School. And he's commenting on a lot of the same problems that I've been discussing. We have an aging society, which is living longer, which therefore needs more healthcare costs. We have increasing healthcare costs from the burden of mental health. And we have low birth rates, which means that we don't have as much money to pay for this, and we don't have enough clinicians. And the distribution of these clinicians isn't suited well. He commented on some of the things he's seeing around the world currently in healthcare just this last fall. First is in China, where there's tons of medical record systems. Pretty much every hospital has their own unique homemade one. They're all siloed. They don't talk to each other. Huge data portability problem in China, but things move very fast in China when they want. And so they're doing a big pilot with universal ID for 1 million people. In Japan, he was commenting on the fact that they really are looking to move to the cloud seriously finally, which is a good thing because of the many physical threats against the local data centers there just from living on an island in that geography. We have the opposite in New Zealand, where there's only one medical record system. And this is kind of what you can do when you have a population of only 5 million people. In the UK, I didn't know about this, but there's apparently a single emergency treatment record, so you can get critical patient information. And the Nordic countries managed to get around the fact of patient privacy laws by passing a new law that said that someone's lifetime aggregated de-identified medical data will be available for machine learning research, which really expedites machine learning research in that area. Coming back to North America and Washington, of course, meaningful uses really exploded to become a bit of a quagmire. There's over 140 required data elements for each visit. But now the priorities in meaningful use are simplified down to managing medication safety, such as opioids, sharing data with patients, using data for public health programs, and building application program interfaces or APIs for interportability. Two last things he commented on: India, the Aadhaar identifiers program, which assigned an identifier biometric to every person in the country. And in Africa, how they used a $100 fingerprint $100 fingerprint identifier using a Raspberry Pi to try to do biometric identification. As you can see, one of the really big themes of what he discussed here is actually trying to do patient biometric identification. And I'll have a post actually in the next week or two discussing this, because I've been doing quite a lot of research on that too with the work I'm doing here in Ampath in Kenya. What should we do? He proposes about 5 things. First, AI and machine learning is going to obviously improve medicine. He said, actually, if AI can replace your doctor, AI should replace your doctor. I mean, you probably don't have the best doctor to begin with if they're that easily replaceable. It has already being used at Beth Israel Deaconess to use machine learning in their scheduling operations, such as for the operating room schedule, to understand how much time a particular patient needs based on their comorbidities for that procedure. And they actually freed up 30% of their OR time, which is a remarkable improvement. And some of the things which we really need AI to help with is help patients navigate the system better, help them understand triage and what the next best step is. We need machine learning. Actually, they're also using machine learning at Beth Israel to read all the faxes. He talked about machine about the mobile Internet of Things, how it's useful, how we're not self-obsessed, and that's why we're tracking things, but we're tracking things because we're actually getting better healthcare, or so he suggests. In his case, he was able to titrate his metoprolol to the right dose with the least amount of side effects. Big data and interoperability is, something we're moving forward on to improve. He actually gave an example in his wife's case to understand what type of breast cancer treatment she requires. He aggregated data from 17 hospitals within the Harvard network and searched it and found that Taxol causes very high levels of neuropathy in Asian women. And so he suggests that his wife's treatment dose be reduced in half so that she wouldn't have symptoms as she's an artist. I didn't know this, but in the area of telemedicine, John does 900 telemedicine calls a year, and he's the national expert for poisonous mushrooms and plants. And, of course, we have major issues with telemedicine in the area of licensure being regionally confined. And he finally commented saying that blockchain obviously has benefits. It's been way overhyped. Some areas he thinks it may be useful would be in being able to have an audit trail and an integrity trail on medical records to prove they have not been changed, to help with patient consent, and to help with micropayments. And he just finally ended with an example of how now that Beth Israel is being paid for outcomes, they had, a patient who would always come in whenever it got hot outside, and this patient would have a $20,000 admission for COPD. And so Beth Israel went and purchased the patient a $269 air conditioner. The patient stayed at home and done well. I agree with his final comment that he doesn't think that the current EHR companies are going to be those companies which create innovation. He proposes it's going to be the companies which are built on top of the EHR companies, which is where the upcoming innovation is going to come from. And finally, the last keynote here, Uniting the Toolset and Mindset of Innovation by Tom Wojcik. Some few random interesting facts from it. He said that we're going to actually produce more transistors this year on the planet than we will harvest grains of rice. Interesting comparison. With the sensors, the age of guessing is finally over. He used the term, I hadn't heard it before, called Generative Design, which is when we use software and we enter constraints and inputs and then allow the software to design, for instance, where the legs on an object or a device should be based off of the forces being self-generated on the design software. It's really cool. I've seen it used in architecture a little bit. And there's a project called the Next Rembrandt where they went in and scanned in different Rembrandts and asked the computer to generate a new one based on these characteristics, which you can check out their website and link online. Last, he commented on a game called the Conversation Map, which is a multiplayer game for those who've just been diagnosed with diabetes to help learn about it and develop a shared and healthy model about diabetes. All right, that was a very long summary, but it was a comprehensive first day at Exponential Medicine. On their live stream, they had 800 plus participants from 500 companies from 44 countries, all there at Hotel del Coronado in San Diego. All the slides on the blog post and in this video are from their live stream. You can watch past Singularity universities on their website. And if you're interested, of course, you can sign up on Singularity University for their future conference. It sells out, and so be sure to sign up early. Tomorrow we'll have Exponential Medicine Day 2 summary.